Okay, so we are live and we are ready to go.
Muchísimas gracias. Muy buenos días a todas y a todos los que están presentes en la sala de Zoom, a toda nuestra audiencia que nos sigue en las diferentes redes sociales de la Asociación Mexicana de Estudios Internacionales. Bienvenidos sean a esta serie de entrevistas, Diálogos sobre China, auspiciado por la MEI, y le damos las gracias en especial a la presidenta Adriana Sletza y al maestro Isaac Flores, así como a la doctora Rocío Arroyo, la coordinadora de la sección de estudios regionales, por tener a bien abrir este espacio de diálogo en el que el objetivo es construir puentes para conversar las comunidades de relaciones internacionales en México, en China y por supuesto abrir este espacio a los colegas, estudiantes, expertos, estudiosos de China en nuestra región. Vamos a abrir esta serie de diálogos con las palabras de bienvenida de nuestra presidenta Adriana Sletza.
Buen día, pues es un gran gusto darles la bienvenida justo a estos diálogos sobre China. Mi nombre es Adriana Ortega, soy presidenta de la Asociación Mexicana de Estudios Internacionales para este periodo 2023-2025. Es un honor para nosotros poder presentar justo estos diálogos sobre China o diálogos México-China, yo diría, ¿no? O sea, son más bien cómo entender sí, desde México mucho más sobre la situación y la filosofía china contemporánea. Y esta sesión de apertura, me gustaría, en esta sesión de apertura me gustaría justo pues darle este reconocimiento a la doctora Priscila Magaña y por supuesto también a todos los colegas en el Comité de Estudios Regionales de la MEI, por supuesto a la doctora también Rocío Arroyo, porque bueno, es gracias a su iniciativa que se está pudiendo hacer esta serie de conversaciones, esta serie de entrevistas que incluyen este diálogo, ¿no? En tendremos varias sesiones, y ya nos comentará ahorita la profesora Priscila cómo va a ser la dinámica. Van a ser varias entrevistas a académicas, sobre todo académicas, ¿verdad? De China, y se van a enfocar sobre todo en las cuestiones de la cultura, el rol de las mujeres, los feminismos desde el sur global, y creo que es muy importante para nosotros este compartir, ¿no? Y el formato de entrevistas me parece que también va a ser o permite un diálogo mucho más constructivo y un aprendizaje colectivo para todos y para todas. En AMEI, por supuesto, estamos muy orgullosas de las distintas actividades y las iniciativas que hacen o que tienen nuestros comités académicos especializados, porque realmente es el trabajo de los comités como justo como el núcleo del esfuerzo de la asociación y también lo que hace que se mantengan activas las distintas iniciativas a lo largo del año, como lo estamos haciendo a través en este día de hoy a través de una sesión virtual, porque son los comités académicos pues los que tienen todo el entusiasmo, las iniciativas. Ayer tuvimos una reunión muy especial con el Comité de Seguridad Internacional, pero también tuvimos la apertura del Comité de Historia de las Relaciones Internacionales a través de un conversatorio en la mañana del día de ayer, y bueno, el día de hoy tenemos la actividad del Comité de Estudios Regionales. En fin, cada semana, al menos a lo largo del mes, tenemos 2 o 3 actividades y creo que hace esto muy importante. Dr. Xiang, welcome to AMEI, and we hope you will be able to participate with us in the future. And thank you for being here. And also, I would take this opportunity to announce our call of papers, the convocatoria for our October AMEI conference in Cancun. The call for papers closes on May 30. So please don't wait until the last week to submit your proposals. So please, I would change to Spanish right now. Quiero justo tener esta oportunidad para poder decirles que la convocatoria está abierta y es muy importante que participen. Vamos y nos damos cuenta que AMEI está cambiando rápidamente, sobre todo porque tenemos que tomar en cuenta las distintas transformaciones que están teniendo las relaciones internacionales en general, y estamos seguros que estos diálogos van a ser sumamente fructíferos y productivos. Gracias a todos y bueno, thank you all of you that are connected and to this virtual session today. And congratulations in advance, Dr. Priscila and Dr. Xiang.
Muchísimas gracias a la doctora Adriana Sletza por estas palabras y la invitación a seguir participando en los congresos de nuestra Asociación Mexicana de Estudios Internacionales. Me presento, mi nombre es Priscila Magaña, profesora y sinóloga. Seré su host en esta serie de entrevistas. Para ello también me gustaría compartir la siguiente información. Vamos a estar en continua comunicación con la comunidad de la MEI para saber cuáles son sus intereses y en ese orden tomar sus iniciativas en consideración y buscar a estos expertos y expertas que sean de su interés. Entonces, hago una nota especial. Vamos a estar haciendo en este esfuerzo intercultural un switch entre Spanglish, pero nuestra entrevista a partir de ahora vamos a cambiarla a español, perdón, a inglés. Y bueno, vamos a tener aproximadamente unos 30 minutos de este conversatorio y después vamos a abrir nuestra sesión de preguntas y respuestas para que la audiencia pueda interactuar con nuestra invitada. Así hacemos también la cordial invitación a todos aquellos que siguen la transmisión en directo a través de Facebook y YouTube. Welcome, Professor Shuchen Xiang. I am going to introduce yourself in Spanish. Voy a permitirme presentarles a la doctora Shuchen Xiang. Ella es profesora de filosofía MT Huang en la Universidad de Xidian en China. También es autora del libro Cosmopolitanismo, chino, historia y filosofía de una idea, publicado por Princeton University Press en 2023. La obra tuvo una mención honorífica en el premio al libro de la sección de Asia y Asia-América de la Asociación Americana de Sociología. Otras obras de su autoría son Una defensa filosófica de la cultura, perspectivas desde el confucianismo y Serie, publicada en 2021 por la editorial de la Universidad del Estado de Nueva York. Otra de sus obras es Un humanismo más completo, la alternativa confuciana al sujeto liberal capitalista. Es coeditoria de las siguientes obras: La síntesis islámico-confuciana en China, publicada por Lexington en el año 2023. Y Cómo China moldeó la ilustración, una historia transcultural del pensamiento moderno, próximo a ser publicado por Routledge. También es traductora del libro Historia de la filosofía china a través de sus términos claves, publicado por Springer en el año 2020. Welcome, Professor Shuchen Xiang. We are so glad to have you here in our first interview in this series.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here today to be able to speak to all of you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
We can start by taking a look. Who is Shuchen Xiang and what is her work?
Oh, do you want me to introduce myself?
Sure.
Oh, so I was born in China, and then I left when I was at the age of 7. So I grew up in the United Kingdom, and so I received my education there, and then I sort of went to, and I did graduate school for a while in the United States, and then some time in Germany as well, and then I ultimately got my PhD and between King's College London in the UK and Humboldt University in Berlin. And then after I got my PhD, my first job was in China, so in 2019. But that was immediately coincided with COVID, so it was like it's kind of terrible for your first job. So I've been in China sort of basically since sort of 2020, with my in sort of my working career. So yeah, I think that's kind of who I am. I kind of grew up between different cultures, I guess. So I have a real big interest in talking kind of philosophically about culture.
Great. The last book that you published is called The Chinese Cosmopolitanism, A History of an Idea. Can you tell us a little bit more about what is this book about and what is the main argument?
Yeah, so I think that, well, I don't know if it's the case in Mexico, but I think growing up in the UK, there's this conception that China is this very homogenous place, that, you know, it's the Han people. And then there's also this very orientalizing stereotype that China was just always the same and it never changed. But that's related to the idea of homogeneity, that, you know, it was just one kind of people and they sort of never changed. But that couldn't be further from the truth. And I thought it was very apposite or timely to bring that story to kind of a greater audience, for people to know that China was actually historically very, very diverse. But then that diversity didn't mean that it was a kind of chaos. Because in philosophy, we have this you have this idea that either you have order or you have chaos, or either you have order or you have some sort of relativism, and it's just absolute chaos. But then the history of China doesn't show that. It shows that dualism is a kind of false one. There was a lot of diversity, but then there was a kind of coherence among diversity. And then there's just so many philosophically interesting implications of that reality that needed to be given a kind of systematic account of. And then I think also because well, you know, there's just China was just getting more and more attention in the world, but then there's always these very wrong, misinformed stereotypes about China. So I thought it was very necessary to put out a very systematic account of how a lot of these stereotypes that are being sort of peddled by kind of media actually couldn't be further from the truth. So yeah, so that's kind of like the motivation for writing the book. And then its main message, and it's another main message of the book was that, so first of all, it's kind of domestically, internally, it was kind of cosmopolitan, it was diverse, but then externally, it was also it was cosmopolitan in the sense that it didn't see the need to ever I would call it colonize other states, and by colonization I mean you exploit people in perpetuity. So those two stories I felt it was kind of necessary to give an account of. So
you're talking about concepts and things that make echo to the American and the Mexican experience. But before we go to that point, you talk about coherence, diversity, cosmopolitanism, colonization, but also about stereotypes. Stereotypes, it's also related to culture. What role does culture play in today's China philosophical worldview?
So I think China, well, as I say so the book was much more about historical China, and I would think that there's still a lot of continuity between kind of historical China and modern China. Obviously, there are differences. There is in some ways a kind of intellectual break, but the history of China is still to a very, very large extent informs contemporary China, I would say. And what we see from sort of historical China is this idea that what makes a self is, I would say, a kind of cultural self. And by that, I mean, how do you define a self? You don't define yourself in terms of your kind of essence. So in terms of your race, or well, race in quotation marks, or your or whether, for example, like aristocracy, if you're born an aristocrat, you're born a kind of higher higher class, and that's the thing that defines you. You know, your blood, you have a particular lineage, you know, that's the thing that defines you. Whereas overwhelmingly in the Chinese tradition, you have the sense that it's what you call your acculturation that is defining of you. So it doesn't matter your birth, but it much more matters how you were brought up in what cultural environment that ends up being the defining thing about you. So I think that modern China would still have that kind of attitude about well, I would say the kind of the nature of the human, what it means to be human, that it's much more the fact of us having culture and then being brought up in particular cultures. That's the thing that is defining of a person, as opposed to some kind of, in philosophy, you would say some kind of ontological essence or something. That is very characteristic of the Chinese worldview, both historically and I would say still into contemporary times. And I think that's actually in the book, I would argue that that's quite distinctive. It's quite different from the kind of a dominant Western conception, which would actually much more see kind of your essence as the more important thing, as taking precedence to culture.
Great. Throughout your work, you analyze the concept of exceptionalism. What do you mean by Western exceptionalism? And is there also a notion of Chinese exceptionalism?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because I think that, you know, we talk about sort of American exceptionalism all the time, but it's actually very, so we use it in this kind of sort of lay terms, and it's somewhat ambiguous. But I think if you're actually very precise about what exceptionalism means, it's actually very interesting. So I think if to understand exceptionalism, so in my account of exceptionalism, I think a way to understand exceptionalism is through this concept of license. So and I borrowed this concept of license from a philosopher called Lewis Gordon, who works at the University of Connecticut. And he used this concept of license to describe what he called whiteness, which is well, he would say it's a system of global invasion that instrumentalized nature and human beings starting from the 15th century. So whiteness is a kind of construct very much embedded to kind of the rise of capitalism and colonialism. Okay, so he talks about license in relationship to whiteness. And what he means by license and whiteness is this license to own the world, and by which is meant this kind of ability to do whatever one pleases to whomever one pleases, and to have whatever one wants. It's a kind of entitlement to everything, and a sort of carte blanche to do whatever one wishes, including killing with impunity. So license is basically action without constraints. So exceptionalism, I think, is very, very much like license, and then that kind of license is very tied up with the identity of whiteness. And then we can understand this concept of license better in relationship to something like freedom, because license isn't freedom. And then Lewis Gordon actually also contrasts license with freedom, because license means actually being above ethics, morality, and law. And it basically means kind of to be a god. It means to transcend all kind of conditioning relationships. There's always constraints on our behaviors, you know, but then license means being kind of free of those constraints, you know, to have a license to kill, you know, like 007. It means to not have any constraints. It's like to be a god. But then so license then is different to freedom, because freedom would mean something like a kind of maturity, which is also kind of responsibility and attunement to other people and living with others. So I think that that's useful. If we contrast the idea of license to freedom, then I think we kind of get a grip on this idea of what exceptionalism means. And I would say that kind of gets to the heart of what is meant by kind of exceptionalism. And if I could just, and I think that if we can also think about exceptionalism in relation to this kind of in philosophy, we have this term called substance, so the thing that the underlying reality of things, and a substance. If you think of, you can also think of exceptionalism, the logic of exceptionalism in terms of a substance, which is a thing that is unconditioned by other things. It just existed as it's always self-identical with itself. It never changes, but then it has a kind of one-way cause efficacy to act on other things, to impose itself on other things. So that's the philosophical concept of license, and I think that of substance, and I think that this kind of exceptionalism, the mentality of exceptionalism, works the same way as this kind of as the philosophical concept of substance, which is a thing that is sort of just sui generis. It just always existed. It doesn't get changed because of its relationship to anything else, but then it can then act on other things. Okay. So, and I think that so what I described exceptionalism in terms of license, and then also in terms of the philosophical concept of substance. But that might be the kind of abstract. But I think that you have a philosopher in Mexico called Enrique Dussel, who actually talked about this way of thinking. You can talk about it in many different ways. You know, I said license or substance, but he talked about it in terms of this kind of like developmentalism. And he talked about how, he said Europe has this account of modernity where they present themselves as kind of, you know, in Kant, he talks about how Europe managed to sort of autonomously overcome its own its own immaturity. You know, so again, this is the idea that you realize truth without being indebted to anybody else, but then because you're able to do that, then you have to sort of like help everybody else to do that. And Enrique Dussel in many different kind of books talked about this as a kind of developmentalist kind of logic. Okay, so the question then is, does China have exceptionalism? So in terms of, so as I described that particular kind of logic, I think is actually a very distinctive kind of logic, which is, I would call it very, the metaphysics of it is very Greek. It's very Greek, and then it's sort of taken on by the European tradition. And so in that sense, if I talk about it that way, then no, China doesn't have that logic, because it had a very different philosophy. It had a very different way of thinking about reality and metaphysics. So it didn't have that kind of exceptionalism. That kind of exceptionalism is very related to your understanding of what civilization is. So, you know, the people who are exceptional already have civilization, and then they impose it on other people. And then so therefore that the civilization is sort of unconditioned. They always already had it. Civilization didn't come from anybody else. It's not indebted to anybody else. It's just always the civilized people who always already had it, and then they give it to other people. You know, it's a kind of racialized logic. So I think that so in my book, I also talk about this. I think very importantly, if you look at how the Chinese thought about the origins of civilization, it's very interesting, because they think of it as a person, some in the midst of time, way back when, there were some sages who were really attentively observed their world. And when they observed the world, they observed the way that different things relate to each other and then manifest as patterns. You know, and then from these patterns, they then derived institutions of civilization. So from this way of thinking, what you're getting is that civilization is always a result of you embedding yourself more into the world and being actively allowing yourself to be conditioned by the world. You know, so that's where civilization comes from. And so that kind of logic is actually very antithetical to that kind of exceptionalist kind of logic, in which you always already had civilization. Civilization didn't come from anywhere, and then you kind of, right? So in answer to your question, I think if I define exceptionalism in the way that I defined it, I think no, China doesn't have the idea of exceptionalism, because exceptionalism, if I analyze it in the way that I did, it has very particular characteristics, and I think that the Chinese tradition shows a very different way of thinking about the origins of civilization, and therefore like the human relationship to world and to other people.
Great. In international relations, like as a social science, we do understand the discipline with an interdisciplinary approach, though our international relations approach to Chinese studies, it's really focused on the philosophical perspective. That's why it's really interesting to hear your answer. So in this regard, how does Chinese or traditional Chinese philosophy, particularly Confucianism, understand this concept that you bring up in your book, Cosmopolitanism? And in what ways this understanding differ from Western interpretations of cosmopolitanism?
Yeah. So that's to answer that. It's related to our earlier discussion, to the one that we're just having. So if I first of all again just define what I think is the orthodox Western view of cosmopolitanism, that will help us to understand what I argued is the Chinese understanding of cosmopolitanism. So we probably all know that that when we say cosmopolitanism, that term comes from the Stoic Diogenes from the 5th century BCE, who was a Stoic, because and then the origins of this word cosmopolitanism is when somebody asked him, like, where do you come from? And he said, I don't come from anywhere. I'm a citizen of the cosmos. And that's very interesting, because in that answer, I think what you're getting is that the dominant Western conception of cosmopolitanism, as articulated by Diogenes, is that basically an uprooted self that is not defined by any cultural or communal context, because it's his transcendence of locale and local allegiance that makes him a citizen of the cosmos, as opposed to any particular community. Because when the person's asking him, where do you come from, they're expecting an answer like, I'm from this polis, I'm from this state or whatever. And then he's saying, no, there's nothing so particular and local that can define me. I can only be defined in relation to the greatest level of description itself, which is just existence, because the cosmos is just existence. So his answer to what kind of question, to what country he relates himself, is to say that he relates to reality or existence itself, the cosmos. That's, if you think about it, that's just like a positive way of saying that he has no particular relationship to anything. So his answer to how you're going to be defined in relation to some context is to assert that he bears no relationship to anything that can define him. Diogenes is, that kind of articulation is what underlies kind of the ideals of cosmopolitanism that are found in, for example, the 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man. And I think that's the kind of the orthodox account of cosmopolitanism. And so under that view, how do you get common public ends? How is it that, because obviously the world is so diverse, we have so many different cultures and peoples, how is it that we can have common public ends, And then under that view, the only way that you can have common public ends is if you're that kind of thin self. We remove layers of things that are particular about us. So for example, I'm Chinese, I'm a woman, I'm in my 30s, but then a man who's in his 60s, who is I don't know, like Indian or something, he can't relate to me. So we have to remove all of these local particularities, and then the thinnest, the common denominator between all of us is this what we call a very, very thin self, a thing that's kind of like the common denominator that unites all of us, which is just that we're human. So I think that, so in the dominant Western conception, you have to what unites all human beings is a kind of very abstract or disengaged self without any kind of group allegiance, and therefore radically autonomous, unencumbered by doxastic commitments, including cultural or religious traditions. So, and then implicit in this view is the idea that if you cannot gain enough critical distance from your culture or your religion, etc., they cannot be cosmopolitan. So, okay, so I think that's the kind of kind of like a dominant Western understanding of cosmopolitanism. But in the Chinese tradition, and I think that you would never think that you can possibly transcend your culture, your social culture, because as we were already discussing, you think of the self as inevitably conditioned. There's no way you can escape that. You're always going to be conditioned by your customs, by if you grew up in Mexico, you're always going to be conditioned by your Mexican culture. If you grew up in China, you're going to be conditioned by local customs and culture, and then it's kind of impossible to sort of escape that, to transcend that. So and so that's the working assumption that I think in that Chinese tradition you have, that you can't possibly have this kind of thin self. And then but then so how does that then, with that assumption, how do you then have common public ends? So under Chinese cosmopolitanism, I think the idea is that you achieve common public ends, not through removing all our differences, if that's possible. I also think that's kind of not very realistic. It's kind of a bit against human nature. But instead, what we want to do is to sort of synthesize or integrate all of these particularities. And in the book, I use a concept from Chinese medicine, which is the concept of tong. So if you go to a Chinese doctor and then you say, "Oh, I'm feeling sick," they'll diagnose you. They'll feel your pulse, and they say, "Oh, yes, your stomach is not the qi is blocked from your stomach to your lungs," or something like that. And so in Chinese medicine, the idea is that for there to be health, everything has to be interacting. Things have to be free flowing. And then there's a Chinese word for this, which is tong, that there's this kind of unblocked, unimpeded free flow. And then, so I think that this idea is also that the Chinese understanding of cosmopolitanism. I think it's cosmopolitan when all the different things are integrate, kind of interacting and resonating with each other in this kind of unobstructed way. So, and so, yeah, so in this, so this particular way of thinking is actually, is really very much accepting that you're a perspective, that you can't transcend your perspective, but the perspectives can then resonate with each other. And then through this kind of resonance, and they can then lead to this this kind of unimpeded free flow, this free flow, this tong. And then that kind of tong, the very ability of these things to interact with each other, and then leading to kind of creative novelties. That's cosmopolitanism. Yes, so I know that I'm speaking to a Mexican audience. So I think you guys know there's a philosopher called Jose Ortega y Gasset. Is that Jose? He wrote in the Meditations on Quixote. He said that, so I think he said something that's very approximates that view that I talked about, this kind of perspectivism. He said that one reaches one's full capacity when one acquires complete consciousness of one's circumstances. Through them, one communicates with the universe. So he's saying that, you don't reach the universal through getting rid of the very fact that you're embedded in a perspective. It's actually, you're really fully aware of your perspective that is somehow like connecting you to the universal. And I think that, so from a kind of Chinese perspective, you would add that it's only when you interact with other people that you have this kind of reflexive understanding of yourself, that you then completely understand your perspective. And then it's that kind of similar logic that I think underlies a kind of Chinese understanding of cosmopolitanism. That isn't, you can never transcend your perspective, but instead it's you want the different perspectives to sort of have this unimpeded free flow with each other. And then that's actually really the definition of cosmopolitanism. And I also think that in the Western, there's a kind of Western kind of multiculturalism as well, in which you're sort of, okay, you accept that people have different cultures, but then the idea is that we leave each other alone. You know, you go to the United States, and then there's like kind of the Irish part of New York, then there's the Jewish part or something, and then you know then there's a view that it's good enough just to sort of leave each other alone, a kind of passive toleration. But Chinese, so under the kind of Chinese cosmopolitanism that I describe, that's not quite cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism must be a kind of active engagement, engagement and resonance between these kind of different parts. Yes. Okay. So yeah, I think I said quite a lot there, so I'll stop talking about that.
It's okay. Shuchen, in international relations, actually, in the Mexican international relations community, last year during the conference, we have this book winner prize, Dr. Cesar Villanueva. He's a constructivist internationalist, and he developed this theory about constructivist cosmopolitanism. Though, just to mention this, in order like to bring bridges together, because even though philosophy, it's a quite of a sister discipline of international relations, as you already said it, our culture conditionates the way that we understand the world in terms of international relations. It also can have influence in the way we theorize international relations and international phenomena. So in this regard, in terms of how these local cultures influence our philosophical point of view or the philosophical point of view of culture, I would like to talk about your perspective of Chinese tradition of cosmopolitanism, and what do you think that this Chinese tradition of cosmopolitanism in pre-modern China challenged the prevailing assumptions of racial universalism?
Yes. So yeah, the book, there's a very kind of pertinent question, because it was trying to challenge a lot of these kind of received truth. So I think that there are a few things that it wanted to challenge. First of all, it's this kind of idea of what I call kind of racial other, and I think I'll kind of explain that a bit more. But I think what I also wanted to challenge was the kind of dominant this dominant theories of international relations, because in international relations, you either have a kind of what they call the realist one, in which every state is self-driven towards their self-interest and will kind of ruthlessly try to dominate everybody else, or there's the kind of the moral position where you do statecraft according to kind of ideals. But I think that in traditional China, the way that they did statecraft can actually it kind of overcomes those dualisms. That kind of a dualistic way of describing international relations doesn't describe how the Chinese thought about international relations, nor how they conducted it. So that's another thing. And then relatedly, I think I also wanted to challenge this idea that power is necessarily domination. There's a I don't know if in Mexico, but I feel like and especially United States, if you look at their rhetoric, often they only understand power in terms of domination or subjugation. And it's always kind of physical domination, and then therefore militarism. If you read John Mearsheimer's The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, he says there's two types of power. There's latent power, and then there's kind of I forget what the other way. The military power, but then latent power necessarily has to go towards military power, because latent power is kind of merely potential and it's not real power yet. All power necessarily has to be sort of military. And I think in traditional Chinese ways of understanding sort of power, and then therefore how you have influence over others, how you do international relations, you have a very different understanding of power. Okay, so those are some of the things that I wanted to challenge in the book, but let me just describe the thing that one of the things I really wanted to challenge, which is this idea of the racial other, that there's a kind of discourse that everybody is born racist, that we're all necessarily we're all born racist, and I argue that no, that's not the case. There's a very particular ideology, a cultural ideology of kind of racialism and racial ideology is very actually unique to particular cultures, that it's not at all the case that biologically we're all just born racist, and then that's the only fate for human beings, that we're all just going to hate the perceived racial other, and so forth. So in the book, I actually argued that to really understand racial ideology, and therefore the reason why in traditional China you wouldn't have had this kind of racialized way of thinking is because you have to understand that the ancestor concept of racial ideology is the Greek concept of the barbarian, because there was a particular way that the ancient Greeks thought about things. The barbarian derives from the term barbaros, so somebody who cannot speak Greek. And because there was, in Greek, logos means both reason and speech, they thought that those who could not speak Greek, so those who do not have logos in the sense of language, Greek language, therefore do not have logos in the sense of reason. And so then there's this kind of connection being made that all foreigners then therefore necessarily are irrational, without reason. And then very famously, Aristotle then kind of canonized this, and then he argued that all barbarians are natural slaves. Therefore, all foreigners are those who are just sort of ontologically, biologically incapable of reason. Therefore, they have to be dominated by a master, which means that they have to be a slave, because once they're a slave, then they can partake of reason by following the commands of the master. So and then this is the ancestor concept of racial ideology, because you're saying there's a particular class of beings in the world who are born for slavery, and that's why in English the N word is so offensive, because it's literally saying that there's that group of people, they're not born slaves, that they can't possibly become properly human because they don't have it in them. If there's some kind of deficiency that they cannot possibly become properly human. And then in the Greek, in the Greek idea, which really profoundly influenced the later European tradition, there's also the idea that civilization comes from when those who bear civilization annihilate or control those who are barbarians. And so that view of how civilization works is a kind of negative one, in the sense that once you destroy the barbarian, then civilization necessarily flourishes. So civilization isn't something creative. It's contingent upon you dominating and destroying the pre-existing bad. So in the book, I try to sort of show that this is really the logic that underlies racialized thinking and racism. And this is a very particular kind of logic. It's a very, you really can't say that all kind of cultures throughout history all had this kind of logic, because, as I described, it's very unique, actually. And then to say then that all, everybody biologically think in these terms, think like this, and I think that that's really this is making too big a claim. So that's one of the things that I try to challenge, that at least well, at least in the Chinese tradition, you have a very different kind of logic. You don't have this particular understanding of barbarism, the barbarian, and then therefore civilization comes from destroying barbarians. You don't have that way of thinking. This is very unique, very distinctive. So that's one of the things I try to challenge, that from that this is a kind of dominant idea, and but at least from the Chinese perspective, that this is, you don't have this way of thinking.
And this is a key point, and because those who study Chinese philosophy, Chinese history, those young sinologists, like, study books in English and Spanish that actually explain and describe Chinese traditional history in terms of these concepts as barbarian, in terms of describe the northern people in ancient China who were culturally different from the Han. So it's really interesting, your perspective, because you are like opening the debate, or the theoretical and philosophical debate. And those students who are going to be reading these books are going to have your words in mind for sure. Okay. Before we go to the Q&A session, I would like to make the last question for you. The historical narrative of Chinese society and government present China as a 5,000-year continuous civilization. Does your book help readers to understand today's China?
Yes, yeah, I think there's, like I said, I think there's a lot of continuity. So in 19th century, through kind of sort of China's semi-colonialism, there was quite a big break between what we call traditional dynastic China and then modern China. But I still think that, just because, like you said, it's thousands of years of history, that kind of heritage is not something you can just kind of get rid of so easily. So sort of imperceptibly, it still had the tradition, and this huge tradition of classical thought, classical literature influences China to the contemporary day. So yeah, so I think there's still a good guide for contemporary China. So for example, contemporary China has this kind of 5 principles of foreign policy, which is mutual respect for sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, non-interference in international affairs, equality and mutual benefit, peaceful coexistence. I think you can understand their way of thinking through the Chinese idea of harmony, so which I also talk about in the book, which is very philosophically very complex, very interesting to sort of dissect. But what is that in some ways at the heart of the idea of harmony, and then also I think operative in this in their principles of Chinese foreign policy, is the idea that if you're very insightful about what things to bring into relationship, you can always create greater value. So that's what this is, kind of peaceful coexistence, equality and mutual benefit. That's not just rhetoric, because I think sometimes people might say, oh, this is just, you're just saying this to sound nice, maybe. But if you look at the ideal of harmony, it's actually very practical, because if you're somebody who's very wise and you can judge, so if you have a room of people and then you're very knowing about human psychology, different people's personalities, and you know their strength, you know who can work well together, how you can work well together, then you end up actually ultimately producing greater value. Or for example, one of the most famous metaphors for harmony in the Chinese tradition is when you're cooking. So when you're cooking, if you just have one flavor, it's very boring. And then the master chef is somebody who's really able to know what flavors work together, and then they really surprise you. It's like, wow, I would not have thought those 2 flavors come together. But then they're the ones with the master chef, because they have the insight to know that what things kind of work well together. And so that is the kind of the essence of harmony. You're insightfully understanding what things can be productively brought into relationship into each other, such that ultimately when you put them together, there's kind of greater value that's produced. And and I think that you can see that way of thinking still in the Chinese foreign policy about creating greater value through kind of cooperation with each other. And then also the idea that I think that well, with the harmony view, it's you can always create greater value. Value isn't some kind of finite thing that already exists, that if you take some, then there's nobody for anybody else. It's actually, no, if you are somebody who's very insightful about how to bring things into relationship, then you will create greater value. So I think that, so in my book, I describe this way of thinking and this harmony thinking, and I think that that's still a good guide for understanding the way that, Chinese foreign policy still operates in some regards. So yeah, that's one way I would say it's still kind of very relevant to today.
Great. Thank you, Professor. We are so glad for all your sharings until now. And we already have 3 questions for you in our Zoom meeting room. So I'm going to read the 3 of them. You already have it on the chat, but I'm going to read it in order for you to catch the 3 of them. And you have the time to answer them in this few minutes that we have left. Okay, the first question, Javier Juarez asks you, how do you see Chinese cosmopolitanism contributing to contemporary debates in global governance and international relations? Abril Cabrera asks you, how could the Chinese metaphysical model change the way international relations are studied today? Alejandro Pescador asks you, says, thank you for your presentation. Could you please recommend us 2 or 3 of the main Chinese philosophers of the last 100 years? Please, Professor.
Okay, so the first question, I can't see it in the chat. It was sorry, could you repeat the first question?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, the first is from Alejandro Pescador. Could you please recommend us 2 or 3 of the main Chinese philosophers of the last 100 years?
Okay. Yes. So you can check out a group of people called the Xinrujia, the New Confucians. They're very there's a group of them. But just check for New Confucians of the 20th century. They're quite famous. There's quite a few of them. And then in terms of political philosophy, I would recommend Liang Qichao. So Liang Qi Liang Qichao, Chao, Liang Qichao. Yes, he has a book that's translated into English on Chinese political philosophy, which I think is very good. So I recommend him. And then also, I think the intellectually the most interesting are the New Confucians, but then there's quite a few of them, so you can and they all have different perspectives. So the New Confucians they were faced with kind of the overwhelming power of the West, and then they still defended the values of traditional Chinese philosophy. So that's a very interesting intellectual moment in history. This is just like the West was so overwhelming, but then they had to rethink through their tradition, faced with this kind of overwhelming reality of that historical situation. So I think I always found them a very, very interesting thinkers. Yeah. Okay.
Great. The second question is from Javier Juarez. How do you see Chinese cosmopolitanism contributing to contemporary debates and global governance and international relations?
So I would say this understanding of power, because in Chinese the word for power, like I was trying to say earlier, in China, you don't see this kind of dualism between kind of realist international relations or kind of idealist versus merely moral, because the traditional Chinese word for moral behavior is de, but de also is very pragmatic, and it also just means power. So it means both. It basically means those two things in international relations simultaneously. It both means that kind of realist, I do things out of self-interest, but then it also means morality, because the view is that it's a much more kind of well, you could say kind of harmony way of understanding things, in the sense that I have power in as much as I can benefit other people, and I can be the person who is smart enough to know what things to do together such that we can make greater value together. And then the really overwhelming image of that way of thinking about power, and then how you can influence other people, because here you're not talking about influencing other people through domination. It's not I'm not threatening anybody. You're not threatening people in order to have power. You have power because you have a kind of charisma, because you have this, right? And then the really overwhelming image of this way of thinking about power is in the Analects. So it's a kind of these records of Confucius's statements, when Confucius said that the person who rules through de, so de as a virtue or as a kind of power, they're like a kind of North Star. They stay in their position, and the myriad lesser stars just circle around them. And that's really the overwhelming image in the Chinese tradition of what real power looks like. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to force anybody. You don't have to threaten anybody, but then you just have influence over people. And I think that you can only really achieve that through kind of mutual cooperation, basically, when you're always able to benefit other people. And then because when you're benefiting other people, people are going to think of you as somebody that it's worthwhile to keep around. They're going to want to keep you around, and then therefore you accrue kind of social cachet, social power, and I think that way of thinking about power is very different from a kind of very militaristic way of thinking about power, where power comes from making sure you're able to control people, you're able to have this kind of total control over the lives of people as a kind of threat, you know. So I would say that that is that view of power that operated throughout China's dynastic history. And if you look at China's relationship to its neighbors throughout history, you know, especially the countries that were basically also Confucian, so Korea, Japan, Vietnam. Yes, that's the kind of the dual kind of view makes much more sense of what's going on between those people than any kind of force of militaristic threat. That particular way of understanding power. So I think so that's just one of the ways that I think that Chinese cosmopolitanism and some of the themes in Chinese cosmopolitanism could change our ways of thinking about international relations, and in this instance, the way of thinking about power and how to get power.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have so many questions in the Zoom chat, and also we have one more question in the Facebook. Okay. I'm going to take one from Facebook. Ulises Bill asked, which book is fundamental to understand the Chinese political thinking?
Which book is important to understand Chinese
political thinking?
Oh, like a classical text? That's a very good question. I think actually, there's a few. I think you could, for domestic politics, you should read the Mencius. So Mencius. He was Confucian, and I think you could probably just read all of the classic Chinese texts. The Analects important, Mencius, Xunzi, Xunzi is important. Those are the Confucian texts. But then the Taoist texts are also important. So Laozi, the Dao De Jing is also important. Yes, I would say that you read those 3 Confucian ones and then the Tao Te Ching for understanding. They're very abstract, but it's so condensed. That's the best one to understand Chinese political thinking.
Great. Abril Cabrera asks you 3 questions. First of all, she asked, how could the Chinese metaphysical model change the way international relations are studied today?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think so for example, our contemporary ideas about the state is the nation state. You know, so it's kind of basically racial in origin. There's one race of people, the Germans or the French, and then that's the fact that they have a common descent. Therefore, means that they're a political. They have a political status, and then the state should be based on that racial or ethnic origin. So China calls itself a nation now, but it's not historically. It doesn't think in terms of that political legitimacy or the political category comes from this kind of common descent. So I think that so. So if you think of the idea of the nation, it's actually it assumes that things are already first of all separate. The Germans, the French, they're all separate already. But I think in the Chinese metaphysical model, like I was saying, everything's actually already connected. It was always connected already. You assume the fact of things being connected and always interpenetrating and interrelating. So therefore you wouldn't take this kind of discrete, sort of discrete, non-continuous category of the nation as a kind of the way of thinking about the planet and our relationship to each other. So I think you would take, if you were going to take the Chinese metaphysical model, it would much more just be that we were continuous with each other, or we were always continuous with each other, and you wouldn't take this kind of discrete, like completely separated things as your first assumption.
Great. I am going to take more questions. Diego Mora says, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. We, the students of international relations, appreciate your time. Analyzing the ongoing trade war between the US and China, we've seen that your country has not been pushed back despite all the tariffs, despite all the retaliations. Indeed, it's accurate to say China has remained strong and they're answering back. So, what part of traditional philosophy can explain this resilience? And the fact China seems to go to the end of any trade war despite American threats?
That's a great question. Very interesting. I mean, I personally think that maybe I don't know if it's much anything to do with Chinese philosophy at this point. I think it's just economically, they think that they can do it now. Because if you look, when China was economically weaker, they wouldn't. I think they, in the 80s or 90s, I don't think they would. They wouldn't have acted in this particular way. So I think it's just the fact that they have a particular. They think they can win the fight, I guess. They have the calculations, the economy. But I think that your word resilience is still very pertinent to China, because there is resilience. And so in the book, I actually described that in China, in the Taoist text, especially the metaphor that they always use is the bamboo. And they love the bamboo because when the wind is really strong, the bamboo bends. So that means that if something's really coming at you and they're so strong, don't fight back because you're going to break. And then the bamboo is great because it keeps its integrity, so it doesn't fall apart, but it kind of bends when the situation demands it. You have to bend. You have to like get rid of your ego, just like hold your tongue and then just suffer it. But then that always means that when the wind is gone, you stand back. So you need that kind of that kind of tensile resilience is really admired. So I think that I would sort of take a slightly longer view of things. So in the, after the opening up, I think China, Deng Xiaoping very famously said, bide your time, and I think that's that resilience way of thinking. Like if the force of circumstances is so strong, the smart thing to do is not to fight it and just to sort of to bend to the situation somewhat. But that doesn't mean you've given up. When the situation changes slightly, you will still come back. You still have you always have your own sense of self. You always know what you want. But that doesn't mean you kind of sort of just like fight fire with fire, and then because you will collapse, and then that's not good for you. That's also not smart. So I think that resilience thing is still kind of very, very important in kind of Chinese ways of thinking.
Well, thank you. We'll go with one of the last questions. Alessandra Garcia, thank you for your presentation. Related to the currently President Trump's ideology, after the Dr. Shuchen Xiang presentation, I understood as an opposite of the Chinese cosmopolitanism you described. So the cosmopolitanism presents a better society as internationalists. How can we implement in our country's international polity to avoid repeating the American pattern?
Yeah, I think that well, there's a lot of things to the American model. First of all, it's exceptionalist. I think it's it thinks of itself as exceptional. I also think that I think it's really related to, I think, humility. In the Analects, Confucius, and I cite this in the book as well, Confucius very famously said, in the company of two others, I'm always able to learn something from. So when there's two people walking with me, so there's three of us, there's two other people, there's somebody who's doing something good, I copy it. It's like, oh, I really like what you're doing, I copy it. But then I note that there's somebody doing something bad, then I make sure to reflect on myself, and I make sure I'm not doing what they're doing. So that's very interesting, because what he's saying is that, well, there's many things you can take away from that. First of all, self-improvement is constant. It's always whenever you're in a company of two people, there's opportunity. Whenever you meet different people, it's a chance for self-improvement. So self-improvement is constant. Learning is constant. So it's a very kind of humble position, it's a humility. But then also very interesting is that when he judges, you're always judging. There's always things that you like about people that you don't like. But in the behavior of the people you don't like, he didn't say, I don't like it, therefore I kind of hit him, or I tell him don't do it. Instead, it's much more I take it as an opportunity to reflect on myself, and then again to like make sure that I improve myself. So I think that model is it's not a moralizing position. That doesn't mean it doesn't have moral judgment. It has moral judgment, but it's not moralizing towards other people. And so it's first of all, it's a very humble position. It's that you want to always be self-improving, and then also I think that attitude towards other people, because you're always gonna, I think, you're always going to see things that you don't like. It's true. It's true. You need to have a kind of a moral judgment as a kind of sort of mature human being. But the way to approach it in this attitude is that you just focus on yourself, because in the Confucian view, once you've perfected yourself enough, other people are always going to see it. Other people will see that wow, you're doing really good. I really admire something that you did, and then humans will, as a part of our nature, kind of have this kind of admiration for particular qualities that they perceive, and then other people might become attracted to you, and then so that through that kind of process you will have a positive influence on other people. You don't just go and change people's behaviors, tell them don't do that. It's through focusing on yourself that it's the most effective way of one day even possibly being able to influence other people. So That's also another aspect of the kind of Chinese cosmopolitanism that I described, that it's, you know, you're always going to be among diverse people, and then there are things that you're not going to like about it, but then that's the kind of Confucian view of how you deal with things that you possibly don't think is morally acceptable. So that's one way of thinking about how a kind of more Chinese way of dealing with things.
Okay, great. And we go for the last question. Javier Hernandez Cesar says, thank you very much for your time. Would you consider the concept of tianxia to be a central element of Chinese cosmopolitanism?
Yeah. So very central to the tianxia idea is that there's no boundaries. That everything is tianxia. So that relates to my point that you don't think of the nation as a kind of the starting assumption. You think of tianxia, in which everything is related. There's no boundaries. And then there's a very famous line from the Great Learning, which is part of the Classic of Rites, and it's this line that in dynastic China, all educated people would have known, and it says that, you know, to be a kind of moral person, what you do is you cultivate the self, you rectify the family, you order the country, and then you bring peace to all under heaven. So all of those things are kind of connected. You always you self-cultivate. You cultivate yourself with a view towards those other things. There's different scales of things, and your ultimate kind of purpose as a kind of intellectual, as a learned, as a person with education, your moral telos is to bring peace to all under heaven. So it doesn't stop at the scale of the country. It's not nationalism. It's never nationalism. It's tianxia. So there's the particular ways that tianxia relates to, you know, there's other scales, but I would say yes. So tianxia is a way of thinking of a borderless kind of the collectivity of humankind in a kind of non-divided way.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Shuchen Xiang from the University of Xijian in China. This was a great first session. We really appreciate your time. We have so many questions in the Zoom meeting. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I really enjoyed being able to speak with you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Y les damos los más cordiales agradecimientos a todas y a todos en la audiencia. Ha sido un placer estar con ustedes en esta primera sesión de la serie Diálogos sobre China. Esta serie va a llevar a cabo entrevistas a diferentes expertas y expertos en temas de China y se llevará a cabo los últimos viernes de cada mes. La próxima será en el mes de mayo. Haremos un break de verano en los meses de junio y julio y continuaremos en el mes de agosto para concluir la serie de este año 2025 en el mes de noviembre. También le damos las gracias nuevamente a la MEI, a el Comité de Estudios Regionales y a su coordinadora, la doctora Rocío Arroyo, a la FES Acatlán y a la Universidad Iberoamericana por también apoyar este esfuerzo. Muchísimas gracias a todos. Esperamos recibir correspondencia por si tienen interés en que veamos algún tema, algún autor o autora en específico. Muchísimas gracias, maestro Isaac. Muchas gracias. Hasta pronto, gracias.